The following is the third in a 3-part review of Fire Emblem Fates. If you haven't watched part 1, I recommend doing so before seeing this one, as that goes over the basics of Fire Emblem Fates. Part 3 will cover the Revelation path. The review begins right now. Revelation's story starts off with the most logical choice in Fates, namely,
Why can't we be friends? 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 I kinda like to be the president.
at least that's what Korn attempts. While they plead for a chance to talk things over, neither side is willing to look for a diplomatic solution. Thus, Korn answers them in the only way they'll understand, by defeating a general on both sides. Unfortunately, this action has the opposite effect, causing brothers on both sides to deem them a traitor, forcing Korn and Azura to retreat to another world in the most literal fashion. It's here where they discover the invisible kingdom of Vala, and how their king Unanswered has been secretly exploiting both kingdoms this entire time. Thus, Korn must unite both sides before the passage between the two realms closes and stop Unanswered from destroying their world, all without mentioning the kingdom this invisible threat hails from because of a curse that would make them disappear. The biggest positive the Revelation can boast is having the most varied cast of the 3 games. With a combined cast of most of the characters from Birthright and Conquest, plus a few exclusives of its own, this third path has the highest amount of supports to explore between the two groups' various characters. Seeing the people from Hoshido and Nor interact with one another is a delightful treat, many of which lead to superb character development, ranging from Oburu earning some well-deserved closure for her parents' death, to Xander and Ryoma competing to see who can be the most diplomatic leader of the two in what appears to them as the first steps toward a peaceful reign between their nations. There is one problem with the way a few character supports are structured, but we'll get to that momentarily. The greater issue at hand is that the story, the events that bring these two parties together, the ones which unite them to fight a common enemy, might be the least satisfying of the 3 main paths. Not the worst, Conquest still holds that putrid title, just the one which yields the least amount of fulfillment when complete. The earlier chapters feel like they're on a loop, with Korn going from group to group, constantly repeating how they're being manipulated, but can't reveal who the true enemy is, with varying degrees of skepticism from both sides. With few people that are convinced, the justification usually comes down to some contrived convenience that stretches out one's suspension of disbelief to its limits. Not to mention that even the ones that initially turned down Korn's proposal do nothing to shave off the fact that the player knows they'll eventually join up a couple of chapters down the line, to say nothing of what convinces them to switch sides. Hey Leo, want to join us in fighting an enemy you've never heard of and can't be told about that requires us to jump off a cliff in order to reach their land?
Traitor.
Well, I'll see you in a couple of chapters when you're cool with riding together with us after seeing that your clearly evil father is in fact evil.
Then again, it could be worse. They could decide to join Korn's cause because their mother's name was also Martha.
That's different.
No, it's not.
Revelation lives up to its title in name alone, since while it does uncloak many of the mysteries about the events and characters of Fates, along with the lingering unanswered questions from Birthright and Conquest, more often than not, the answers it gives feel more like a D-grade response to a fill-in-the-blank section that was hastily written down during the last 5 minutes of a test. For example, while it's good that Garen isn't given a ton of time to show how much evil they extrude from every orifice of their body and was upon this entire time, the final boss, the true mastermind, the manipulative schemer behind the events of all 3 games, being yet another giant monster, is perhaps the laziest excuse the writers could have gone with, as if they needed to avoid answering any of the morally complex or interesting questions about why these two are going to war beyond vague references to the 2 kingdoms being historically at odds with one another, to say nothing about the tactics they use, that the game brought up to begin with. It doesn't help that this is all spelled out almost immediately after the battle that sees Korn banished, making the mystery for this, for lack of a better word, revelation, should have non-existent. Doubly so if you haven't played the 2 other paths. Likewise, without delving into the Hidden Truth DLC that portrays Unanswered as a figure of tragedy which, itself, feels a bit rushed in its haste to set up how the children from Awakening can show up here, Revelation doesn't provide any sort of personality or greater motivation to them beyond, they're angry, therefore everyone must die. They're basically every Final Fantasy villain since 6 boiled down to their core without any of the substantial traits that made those characters so memorable in their respective games. it really makes you appreciate the fleshed out rogues gallery that made up previous games, save for Radiant Dawn, and that's without getting into the fact that you shouldn't need to play through supplementary material in order to fill in the holes that the main game left wide open. It's an excuse to bring the two kingdoms together, and the role holds little importance in the narrative, aside from serving as the equivalent of a piñata for a group of kids to beat in celebration of the cool kid's birthday party. On top of that, Revelation suffers from many of the same issues that plague the other two paths. Repetitive writing near the beginning that stops about halfway to stretch out its length to match the other two paths, only to move to pointless killing off characters for the sake of raising up body count.
Having finished Revelation, I feel I finally pinned down the big problem with Fate's overall plot, aside from the contrivances that plague each of the three paths. That being that the focal point of the game isn't on the war and how Corrin reacts to it, how they play a big part in the overarching events, but rather about making Corrin into an almost godlike being whose mere presence can alter the fabric of reality with every whim.
They certainly aren't glorified to the extent where the defining trait is literally an ability to predict what's going to happen next in the plot, like Micaiah was in Part 1 of Radiant Dawn, but the game treats them like they're the one moving the pieces around, rather than a piece on the chessboard. They're the only person who seems to be capable of doing something besides spouting exposition and excelling at killing people, being the only one with more than half a brain, to try and open up a diplomatic channel between the two kingdoms. Heck, the main reason Xander and Ryoma decide to fight in the first place and kick off the early events in Revelation is because they're trying to keep their oh-so-wonderful younger sibling from siding with the opposite family. Sure, it doesn't work, but they're the only ones who made the attempt. Not even Xander and Ryoma tried that. Much like the Crystal in Conquest or Leo's book in Birthright are completely contrived plot devices whose sole existence is to get the characters to follow a predetermined set of events, to see nothing of everyone rallying around the naive person who literally tells people to jump off a bridge in Revelation, Corrin being the end-all solution, or stumbling upon one to resolve a given conflict whenever it's convenient for the writers to keep everything moving forward, just robs each past story of any drama or conflict. In Revelation's case, the difficulty of recruiting the various characters should present, making it feel less important or challenging than it should be for Corrin to face its hardships, and even less satisfying for when they overcome them. Admittedly, it's been a while since I played through Path of Radiance in its entirety, but it's easy to recall how the war in that game carried a lot of tension, mostly because Ike wasn't treated as the greatest person in the series like he was in Radiant Dawn and, to a lesser extent, Fire Emblem Awakening. He was just a guy whose father happened to run a mercenary company, which said father later revealed to be the greatest swordsman who ever lived, and the events that drove that game, i.e. saving Ike's homeland from a tyrannical king, restoring the monarchy, and getting revenge on his father's killer, played out in such a way that made each goal seem meaningful to the character and compelling to the player. That's what made Ike such a great character. There were many times throughout where Ike doubted himself as being the potential best leader for the Grail mercenaries or the forces liberating Crimea due to his lack of experience, with other characters supporting his uncertainty, such as when they go their separate ways due to their lack of faith, and Ike in a role commanding any sort of authority. Ike felt like a real person within the world of Tellius who not only acknowledged his weaknesses, but aspired to be a better person, both to eventually beat the man who murdered his father, and ultimately become someone worthy of leading the Grail mercenaries. But even in the case of Ike, the game still treated him as just that. Ike, a person. It made you want to follow this person's journey to see where they end up, rooting for them to succeed in what appears to them as one Herculean task after another. With apologies for the following broad generalization, when playing through the other localized entries in the Fire Emblem series, you get the feeling that these characters, the leads for each game, are just small parts of a more grand and complex world, literal chess pieces on a board, who could easily be toppled over if the wrong move is pulled. Heck, Rekken no Ken ends with Athos dying while foreseeing dark times for his friends, making it seem like everything the leading trio fought for may have all been for naught, which fits with the tone of the bittersweet ending, and the unfortunate foreshadowing of Hector's fate that comes full circle in Fuen no Tsurugi. While people such as Eliwood and Marth were of royal heritage or were born into a status of privilege, previous entries in the series like the Sacred Stone didn't spend half of the dialogue talking about the amazing heroism of Erika and Ephraim just because they were the heirs to Renee's vacant throne. It focused on the conflict with Grado as the Empire successfully destroyed the Sacred Stones and telling the story of two twins trying to prevent their homeland from becoming an utter ruin, all while witnessing the fall of one of their closest friends. There may have been the seldom line where they exclaim their confidence in one another's abilities when separated, but even then, it's clear that the dialogue is spoken out of concern for their siblings' well-being, rather than it is to remind the player of how awesome the two of them are. Even Awakening, much as it's criticized for its overuse of cliches for plot elements and characters, many of which were taken into account when crafting Fate's story for its trilogy of titles, there was the occasional moment where the party was thrown off guard, put into an unfavorable position, where everything appeared to be in a grim state. No such moment exists in Fates. Events that slow down the war do happen, but they're treated more as deviations, or at best, minor inconveniences, than they are major obstacles to overcome. Which may also stem from the weak writing for the villains that fails to make any of them feel like they're a legitimate threat. Aside from Garen and Iago, whose memorable qualities are how utterly dedicated they are to being the absolute worst villains in series history, not a single foe really sticks out as particularly dangerous or even noteworthy. They all just blend together and feel interchangeable, which can be said for a lot of what happens in Fates. Again, without getting into explicit detail for every entry, the point should be fairly clear by now. Fates utterly fails to make its lead worthy of being the heart of the game instead of where the story should be focused on. Not to say that there isn't anything praiseworthy in stopping a war on as grand a scale as this, let alone the unique accomplishment throughout each of the three paths, but much like how Conquest plot conveniences only make the events seem even more ridiculous as they continue to occur, so too does Revelation, constantly mentioning how important and special Corrin is based on the merit of their birth status, without their actions properly reflecting any of the prestige they've garnered. The unification of these two kingdoms, after what's said to be a long history of tension between the two, should be a monumental task to heal the wounds this war opened up. But all Corrin does to solve this seemingly tricky task is to repeat how everyone is actually being manipulated by someone they've never heard about with zero evidence to back up their claims at the time they make them, and everyone eventually comes around to believing them just because Corrin is that trustworthy of a person, even the ones who may doubt him in previous chapters. That's Revelation in a nutshell. One long road of dissatisfaction to travel in a vehicle that has barely any fuel left in the tank. Yes, it reveals the answers to questions the player may have been asking after playing through Birthright and Conquest, but the answers it provides are incredibly unsatisfying, along with some secrets that were perhaps best left unsaid. Spoiler time, everyone! You know the drill. Skip to here if you want to avoid them. And here we go.
The main driving force behind the big decision in Fates stems from Corrin's heritage and who they consider, or rather who the player considers, to be their family, i.e. would you choose the family you were raised by, or the one you were born into. Now, setting aside how thoroughly one-sided the portrayal of this scenario is, while Corrin is related to one of the characters in the game, that someone is not Takumi, Ryoma, Hinoka, or Sakura. Yep, we're talking about this.
This revelation is an incredibly irritating one. Not just because it cheapens the whole blood or bonds conflict that's supposed to be the central hook of Fates, not only because it's a lazy way to justify how it's totally okay for Corrin to marry their own siblings as the ultimate fan wish fulfillment, but also because of what the player learns about their true birthright in Revelation. In all three of the game's paths, one of the many marriage options for Corrin, that is, if the player chooses to make Corrin male, is Azura. Unlike Corrin's siblings on both sides that are marriage options, Azura's revelations to Corrin is a wee bit thicker than water, since one of the many revelations on the third path is that Corrin and Azura are cousins. Their mothers were sisters of Valite lineage, making the two of them related by blood, Corrin in particular being the heir to the throne of Vala. So throughout all three games, Fire Emblem Fates provides an option for the player to marry someone who is directly related to them, regardless of whether or not the player knew it at the time, because the developers and writers sure as hell did.
Congratulations, Fire Emblem Fates! You're keeping it spirit with the one thing that no one thought was a good idea in Seisen no Keifu. Full-on incest. Bravo.
I somehow feel that I have always loved you.
In the off chance that somebody in Talent Systems is listening to this review, what were you thinking? Whereas Conquest story leaves a frustrating bit of bile boiling in your stomach, Revelation leaves an unsatisfying feeling after scarfing everything down because what qualifies as a surprise comes across as so predictable and uninspired outside of the aforementioned astonishing inclusion of incest. Seriously, Intelligent Systems, what were you thinking? One of the late-game surprises Revelation has in store is the answer to if there's someone in the party who may or has already betrayed them. The answer to this being Gunter. In the penultimate chapter, there's an attempt by them to frame the campaign into Vala as Corrin and Azura tricking everyone into coming here so they could kill them, preying on everyone's xenophobia due to their true heritage, except the player knows that the only reason they're doing this is so that Corrin can point out that they are the traitor thanks to an obvious slip-up on Gunter's part in a previous chapter, not to mention that it's been shown multiple times that everyone under Corrin's command trusts them to an unwavering level. They literally leaped off a cliff because he told them to. It makes zero sense for anyone to be suspicious of either of them, given everything they've seen up to this point, let alone for Gunter to make such an unfathomable claim and assume that anyone would believe him.
The behavior is highly illogical.
To bring up yet another Sacred Stones comparison, there's a Grotto general called Ducel who, despite his loyalty to his country and the Emperor, questions the benefit of this war for either country, and is sentenced to death for not following their rulers' every whim, which sends him into an almost suicidal rate due to how he feels his life, his service to his people, is now meaningless. In his lowest moment, Ephraim convinces him that the best way to serve his country and people is to live as a traitor and stop this unjust war that Grotto is waging, which is both inspiring and a clever way of getting Grotto's highest ranking general to pledge their acts to your cause, while also showing Ephraim's leadership skills, intelligence, and charisma in a single scene. It's a great moment that served more than just as some narrative justification for Ducel changing sides. Of course, it helps that they establish Ephraim was taught the lands by Ducel, and thereby organically inform the player of their relationship prior to this conversation, but even if they didn't, the way that the scene was written, along with everything else that was established about the character up to that point, makes their change from red to green to blue all the more believable. Namely because Ducel felt like a real person who had real moral issues with the actions that Grotto partakes in during that game. Point being, you get why, based on the eternal logic of Sacred Stone's world and its characters, they made that decision at that time and empathized with them for the consequences they faced. There's a similar "you'll live knowing you're a traitor" moment between Gunter and Corrin in Revelation, once the obvious is done in the open, but it doesn't work when A, the betrayal is so obviously choreographed that it's a surprise Corrin didn't suspect him sooner, and B, they don't show the characters' relationship beyond a few lines telling us about it after the twist has happened. With the motivation for Gunter that amounts to his family being killed by evil von Fantasy Drum and wanting revenge because all royals are, in their eyes, the exact same as the blob monster who happily sees an entire village wiped out. As such, the moment just feels hollow and cheap, namely because the way it's written comes across as completely inorganic. One might bring up the perfectly logical argument to leave any of Gunter's character development or his relationship to Corrin to the support conversations like so many other characters, if not for one of the most baffling design choices in series history. Namely, they don't give him any supports in Revelation. Now, in Conquest, he was only given one, much like a shocking number of characters throughout all of Fates, but in Revelation, Gunter doesn't have a single support with any of the characters to aid in their development aside from the aforementioned preaching of his family. Both mechanically and narratively, this makes zero sense. If he was trying to deceive Corrin, wouldn't it have made more sense to pretend they care via supports? I.e. seem like they're more in character, perhaps with a different conversation or a different few lines or words? Even if you argue that they shouldn't have any supports because they were possessed by Anankos?
Oh, did I forget to mention that? I mean, it changes absolutely nothing about everything that I said before, but still, it's a thing.
They're knocked to their senses and gain their autonomy back before the final chapter. So what's to stop a few skirmishes from developing it further for the two of them, or any of the other characters for that matter? Better yet, wouldn't it be more interesting to see their bond free Gunter from Anankos' wrath with, say, an A-rank support, rather than being told how important the relationship was when it occurs? A silly solution? Perhaps, but it's no more so than the multiple deaths featured throughout all three games. Fates kills characters off like they're consuming candy one at a time, with little regard for making any of their deaths meaningful. They fall through making the player feel anything when said characters die, because the ones that do end up being axed are the ones that the game barely gave any time to develop or make the player invested in them beyond Scarlet sure is good at taking out enemies. Revelations is the worst in this regard, not only because of the amount of main characters who die and the lack of emotion said deaths invoke, or the lack of conversations about the deceased, but because they bring characters back from the dead just so they can kill them off, like it's a do-over. In one of the later chapters, Queen Mikoto is brought back to life under the possession of Anankos, with the worst part of her resurrection being that the inevitable clash between her and Korrin's forces denies any of her children the ability to talk to her whatsoever in battle, aside from Korrin. I'm starting to think that this game considers them to be pretty important. Now, they do share a conversation together at the end of the chapter in what is supposed to be a relatively bittersweet farewell, but said conversation is just as fluff-filled and lifeless as the rest of these mundane attempts at striking a chord through killing off characters. What's more, the lack of dialogue between the characters makes them and their relationships feel less important than they should be within the game's world. Their connections are informed more by their title, i.e. Mikoto is their mother, than they are by the characters' relationships or the interactions that are seen with one another. Without wishing to sound like a broken record, in previous games, these battle conversations were more the caramel covering that topped a delicious chocolate cake of character development, rather than just shoving a face full of icingless cake that has about much flavor to it as Dale's bagels down the player's gullet. It makes especially little sense in this case for them not to include any individual conversation between the Hoshido nobles and their mother, let alone one for Takumi, whose entire character arc in Conquest is sparked by his mother's death, blaming Korrin for what happened to her, as well as himself for not being strong enough to protect one of the people closest to him. Despite how important Mikoto may be to him, the story deems their relationship on par with Ryoma's unsettled attraction to Scarlet, exemplifying less than an iota of interest in explaining why this character matters so much to them beyond it's their mother. They even bring back their father, Sumeragi, who also doesn't have anything to say in battle to his children, save for Ryoma, which at least does have some relevance pertaining to his character, since it's meant to show how he's grown since they first fought in Chapter 5, whose appearance feels more like the writers needing to resolve the lingering plot thread of who exactly was that hooded person that attacked Ryoma in Chapter 5. Except that person was clean-shaven, whereas Sumeragi has an impressive amount of facial hair, along with a different physical build, something no hood is going to cover up, so this revelation is particularly nonsensical. Like with their mother, the Hoshidan royalty does share a moment with their father near the end, but said moment copies the same contrived drama that scene invoked with their mother. Worst of all, the game splits time during this hollow moment between Sumeragi apologizing to Korrin for not being able to protect them on the day Garen kidnapped them, even though by the game's own admission, they're not your real father, while grouping his other kids together with a generic, "Gosh, you've all become super strong. And let me talk about how awesome the one who's not related to me is," conversation before passing away.
You can't just kill off a character and call it a stake-raising, emotion-driven, avant-garde moment, when all you did was cross off the name from the script for the next chapter. Characters shouldn't be treated as disposable playthings for the writer to get bored with before tossing them in a toy box, especially when neither the personality nor character development, assuming the game even bothers to give them any, nor the events that lead up to their death, make the player care about them.
Compare, say, Scarlet's death in Revelation with that of Lyon's in the Sacred Stones, where the game was all about establishing its importance to the characters and the overall story. The Prince of Grotto, Lion was the person responsible for the events that drove the war Grotto launched from the inception of the story. After trying to save his father's life and prevent his people from dying in the future using the power of Grotto's Sacred Stone, he succeeded in bringing his father back to life, only to lose his humanity due to the creation of a Darkstone and the soul of the Demon King slowly corrupting him, which led to the main conflict of Grotto fighting the other nations, the ultimate goal being to destroy each of the Sacred Stones. He was also good friends with Erika and Ephraim, with the two of them having frequent flashbacks to the good times they shared together that stands in contrast to the potential puppet whose strings are being pulled by a demonic presence. What's more, while it was ambiguous throughout most of the game if Erika and Ephraim's flashbacks are presenting a rose-colored retrospective of their fallen friend as a form of self-defense due to their disbelief that someone as pure as Lion would cause the death of so many people for what appears to them as a pointless war, all of these interactions added to the tragedy of the character, how such a selfless goal, such as saving his people, ultimately resulted in his humanity being torn out from under his skin, which results in many heart-wrenching confrontations throughout the game with a character that the player ultimately grew to care about just as much as the main ones within the game, culminating in an ending that makes it all the more heartbreaking to see them go. In Revelation, there isn't any build-up to Scarlet's death, be it emotionally or dramatically, and the impact it has on the main characters extends to the aforementioned plot point with Gunter's betrayal and leaves so little an impact when it happens, so it just amounts to a higher body count. This isn't to say that Revelations is a failure, far from it. What Fates is trying to do across all three of its paths, bucking the status quo when deconstructing the series' design philosophy, is intriguing on the surface, but a quick glance underneath seems to highlight how bad a shape the gears the writing across all three of Fate's games happens to be rather than bring to light any potential flaws in the previous Fire Emblem games. One of the prevalent themes throughout all of Fates is that of trust. Specifically, the player's tendency to place their faith in absolute strangers to do the right thing with little regard for any treachery or attempt by them to potentially take their life. A commentary on the series' tendency for the main character to accept so many of the enemies into their ranks, many of whom wear the exact same armor as the enemies while in said ranks, who may have potentially dubious definitions on alliance, or have the intent of assassinating them if they look away at the wrong moment? That's an intriguing, dare I say, inspired concept. However, each path, either by telegraphing who the traitor will be to the point where a newborn with no knowledge of story structure or tropes could figure out who it's meant to be, or making said treachery inconsequential, fails to deliver on that prospect. Not to mention that as far as recruiting the enemy is concerned, mechanically speaking, Fates doesn't have very many. There are characters who start as enemies that become allies, enemy units who turn into other units, basically allies who haven't been recruited yet, on later maps, or even characters who join you out of nowhere. But as far as the gameplay is concerned, the only chapter where you recruit an enemy unit, on the very same map where you can fight them, is Chapter 14 of Revelation, the one with Benny and Charlotte. The one which, despite Benny and Charlotte being close friends, Benny himself can't recruit Charlotte. That has to be done by Elise because the writers forgot. That's probably the best reason.
The idea is sound, fascinating even, but the game's mechanics and design don't match up with what the writing is trying to say. Mainly because of the quality of the writing in the later chapters, but I digress.
If you want to gain the Delson friendship and trust done right, go play The World Ends With You. At least that game doesn't have incest. Having gone over the bulk of Fate's mechanics in two previous videos, covering Revelation's gameplay is going to be brief. Namely, since it can be summed up in 2 words. Poor execution. Despite having the combined tools of units and various My Castle features of the 2 paths, Revelation never adds up to anything more than the combination should have created, partially because the availability of said units is pretty terrible in the earlier chapters. Given that each troop will be able to gain more experience due to the lower amount of units to raise, these earlier sections will lead to unusually high levels for what few troops you do have at your disposal that makes going through them a cakewalk never before seen in such a grand form in the series, to say nothing of the later chapters where the game will throw up to half a dozen new units on a single map. Speaking of maps, Revelation goes to show how important objectives, layout, and reinforcements are in terms of whether they complement or clash with a given map's design, especially on the maps shared between the 3 campaigns. Take, for example, Chapter 10 of Conquest and Chapter 14 of Revelation. In Conquest, this mission is treated as a defense mission, protecting a breach in the Green Zone from Takumi's forces for 10 turns. What makes this map so brilliant is the way it's designed with various tools that provides the player with the means with which to best defend their objective, even if they haven't properly prepared themselves due to them struggling with the prior maps, ranging from a magical orb that lets one of your 2 mages attack from afar, to a second seal that lets Mozu man one of the 2 ballista by turning her into an archer, to some last-minute reinforcements that can help turn the tide of battle. While going on the offensive is rewarding in its own right, both figuratively and literally, as the map's extreme challenge makes facing down Takumi on the opposite side immensely satisfying to pull off, along with a granted elixir upon victory, the best strategy to ensure everyone's survival is to keep allied units close, weaken foes with the 2 ballista, and hold the line until the assault dies down, before grabbing the goods via visiting the various villages caught in the ongoing clash. The way Conquest approaches this map, from the enemy placement being clumped together for the best possible use of the ballista, to the walls units can hide behind and possibly strike an opponent from afar before said walls break under the constant enemy fire, to the unit deployment position itself, it's about as close to perfect as an under siege scenario one can get without being behind a castle's walls. Revelation, meanwhile, goes for the polar opposite. A full-on siege whereby the player must rout all the enemies on the map, which isn't as effective in terms of encouraging the player to make use out of all the tools that provided from the starting point, when the goal is to march one's front lines further and further away from their starting point, along with the side objectives of recruiting Benny and Charlotte. It's a decent alternative, but it's nowhere near as memorable a map as it was during Conquest, which is indicative of the game as a whole. Revelation's campaign isn't necessarily bad, but it's neither as challenging nor rewarding as Conquest or Birthright's take on the same maps. The original maps don't fare much better, despite some relatively intuitive propositions. Chapter 26 of Revelation might have made for an interesting defense mission, with enemies assaulting your group from both sides had that been the objective, but the way it's designed makes it even more of a cakewalk than any arena abuse ever could have. Remember Chapter 21 from Conquest, where the respawning enemies had a skill that prevented their recurrences from being easily exploited, and also helped to prioritize the map's mission objective, that being to escape? Well, apparently the designers forgot, because here, all of the constantly respawning enemies will grant experience points, while handing Azura and Corrin a 3x3 grid that surrounds them, which makes it more difficult to be hit, and heals with few injuries that do make contact with nearby allies or themselves. While it does succeed from a narrative perspective, given the events that played out prior to this skirmish, by having the player's party stick together for the best results, i.e. them being stronger together than separated, from a design perspective, it encourages exploiting the pools that enemies spawn from for easy late game experience, rather than prioritizing and using the Dragon Vein mechanic to prevent them from coming in. Not that the enemies already on the map require any sort of effort in terms of strategy. There's no incentive not to do so, since it doesn't cost the player any gold like scouting does. The characters sticking together will be able to improve their supports more effectively before the final chapter. The size of the map neutralizes any fear of what few that do pop up may overwhelm the player and have a lower chance of being injured, even if they are underleveled due to the terrain advantage the two characters grant them. Revelation's campaign is easily the least satisfying of the three. Not just due to the amount of troops, given the aforementioned terrible availability throughout, but because the actual maps units are deployed on are lacking in any real challenge in terms of structure. Chapter 16 and 17 is the only time Revelation flashes any sort of teeth due to being one of the few times in Fates where the chapters are consecutive, i.e. the player can't save or exit the map until they've beaten both of them. Except you get 4 extra units in Chapter 16 and 6 extra units in Chapter 17, both of which hand over 2 of the best units in the entire game and their respective exclusive powerful weapons. The best thing can be said about it is that at least it's not the snow map. No, not that one. That's actually a pretty decent tug-of-war scenario that forces the player to think defensively and bide their time until the Dragon Vein appears. No, it's this snow map. The idea behind it is similar in vein to a fog of war encounter in terms of anticipating the enemy with little certainty of their location outside of one's memory from playing the stage, but in practice, it's an exercise in monotony. The low deployment, the utter boredom of tearing through tons upon tons of snow, and finding a route to the level's boss, it all moves along in such a sluggish manner that you'll be even more thankful that the skip button exists to cut down on the amount of time tackling this tedious wall of white fluff of a stage. It's easily the worst map in all of Fates. Not that every map in Revelation is bad, the majority of them are passable, but so many are filled with such promising ideas that it's utterly maddening to bear witness to the end results. Missed opportunities tends to be a recurring theme throughout all of Fates, since there's a surprising number of characters who are given a sole support. Now, there were characters in previous entries who only received a handful of support conversations, usually the Manichees, but not only were said conversations among the best the respective games had to offer, more than justifying their minuscule existence, they didn't just stick to the main character as a romantic option, to say nothing of the lack of character development they're given that amounts to shipping fodder at best. Whatever else can be said about Radianton's abhorrent, butcher's work of a support system, at least they included conversations at each party's respective base to help flesh out its vast cast throughout its bloated boil of a campaign. The abundance of single support conversation characters in Revelation is especially unusual because its highlight comes from the interactions between these two parties' varied and very colorful personalities, with plenty of potentially interesting conversations that could have led to some character development for minor characters instead of their sole existence being a dedicated romance option for Corrin. Imagine Gunter and Rena sharing stories about the various battles they partaken in, reflecting on the decisions which led to the position that they currently hold in their respective armies. Some of these don't even make sense. It's established that Scarlet and Ryoma have a mutual interest in each other, and Ryoma being really bad at hiding his affection to Scarlet, yet Scarlet can only gain a support with Corrin. The game flirts with the idea of the former two being an item, yet it never lets the player have the opportunity to see the relationship develop any further. This gets into a bigger issue with how supports have been handled in the past few entries. In the Conquest review, I mentioned how botched the same-sex relationships were for Niles, along with the various problems with the framing of Fate's same-sex supports. And while that without a doubt needs to improve in the next entry, frankly, if they're going to continue featuring marriage in the next Fire Emblem, or supports in general, there needs to be a more diverse representation of different sexualities and the relationships people form with one another. You know, like they did in past games. Awakening in Fate sees marriage and intimacy as the end goal of a relationship rather than one of the many possibilities, an attitude that's indicative of how the supports have been handled in those games. There are some truly sublime support conversations that feel complete without an S-rank support to cap them off, mostly because the final conversation a given pair shares sticks out due to the relationships the characters previously held wouldn't lead one to believe that the two would become romantically involved, to say nothing of how little variety there is in how these proposals play out. Rarely do they ever build on the relationships that were established in previous conversations, becoming a tiresome retread of the same formula. A character confesses a crush they had for a while, and the other character just happens to reciprocate their affections, thus they decide to get married and have a child. Coupled with the thoughtless explanation for how the parents and children are able to fight alongside one another this time around, and the generally generic endings each pairing provides, it gives the impression that the marriage mechanic was a last-minute addition to Fate due to its popularity in Awakening, rather than a well-thought-out expansion on the territory Seisen Keifu and Awakening had previously covered.
This is without getting into the, frankly, creepy eugenics undertone that's been present in the past two games, in that there's somehow a superior choice for a given child, given how their stats, skills, growths, and classes are determined by their parents, which, once you notice it, is rather unsettling, especially when coupled with the aforementioned incest. Oh, but we can't have gay people adopting children, that's just crazy.
There's a brief glimmer of this much-needed variety seen in Seizo and Kagero resuming their romantic relationship, but like so much of Fate, the backstory informs the player that it exists in the S-rank support conversation, rather than making the existence of said backstory important to the current relationships throughout all of the supports they share. But to return to Revelation, with as many characters as it has, there were more than enough opportunities to explore relationships beyond the typical romantic interest. Have characters reject another's romantic advances, or end the relationship in tragedy. See someone become a single parent with zero interest in getting involved with their allies beyond, you keep me alive, I'll keep you from dying. Forget about standard supports, have post-mortem conversations between characters for when one of them bites the dust, where people talk about why that character was so important to them and how close they became after spending so much time on and off the battlefield. This is all in retrospect, of course. Like so much of Revelation, there were some shiny looking keys for one fine looking Ferrari, but instead of letting the player take it for a ride, it prefers to tauntingly jiggle them in front of their face while letting them roll around in a serviceable sedan. At this point, there's little else that can be said about Revelation's presentation that isn't applicable to the other two. Excellent attention to background details, superb soundtrack, and gorgeous cutscenes that beg to be shown on a high-resolution screen. Frankly, the only part about the entirety of Fate that's left to note is one fairly nonsensical element that amounts to a nitpick, that being the character's tendency to hit their opponent so hard that it causes their armor to fly off. There's even special weapons built around stripping characters down to their undergarments if they possess a weapon advantage. Whatever else can be said about the inclusion of other joke weapons is that the smile they produce at least doesn't constantly feel so out of place with the tone the story keeps trying to tell.
Then again, this is the same video game that, in the Japanese version, decided to be a good idea to include a face-rubbing minigame that is yet another piece of fan wish fulfillment fantasy and feels woefully out of place with the rest of the game. I'm gonna be blunt, in terms of the three main paths, Revelation brings the least amount of the table in terms of what can be discussed and absorbed. And yet I managed to talk about this path in particular for over half an hour, go figure.
As far as the localized Fire Emblem games go, it's middle of the road, bordering on the lower end, meaning that while it's a fine game in its own right, the other two games trump it in almost every regard, with Birthright boasting a better story, while Conquest has the honorary Best Design in Series History award. The story in Revelation isn't the worst of the three, but it is certainly the least of them, the least well-structured, the least interesting, and the least capable of getting the player invested in the events and characters regardless of the aid provided by support conversations. It is the weakest of the three main paths by far, and fails to lessen any lingering bitterness the other two may have left with their respective shortcomings, at best replacing with Revelation's own slightly sour aftertaste. At the same time, it best exemplifies the qualities, both good and bad, of the entirety of Fire Emblem Fates. Having played through all 3 games and sampled a good amount of the DLC, I feel it's safe to say that while it was an interesting experiment, the results were often less than the sum of its parts. It was a massive step forwards in terms of the gameplay department, the tools of which to craft levels around have neither been more advanced nor as plentiful as before, but it represents a remarkable step backwards in terms of storytelling. Fates has some of the brightest ideas in series history that, more often than not, are screwed into the wrong socket and blow up in a spectacular fashion. This isn't to say that the series shouldn't explore different methods of mirroring its gameplay and storytelling in the future. It needs to grow and change. It's why Fates was designed the way it was, to tell a more complex story while simultaneously responding to the criticisms made by critics and the new fans' awakening garnered. Telling 3 separate stories to explore different factions, their reasons for going to war, their philosophy, is an ambitious endeavor that none of the games truly capitalized on. Themes of trust are brought up, only to never be explored in any meaningful capacity, while the same repetitive dialogue stretches out 3 stories that should have been condensed for the sake of a more lean and satisfying experience, rather than the bloated mess that the trio make up.
While Intelligent System claims they couldn't find anyone in the games industry to write the story they wanted to tell, it's hard to imagine it turning out in its current state had they found someone with previous experience writing about complicated choices and politics like Asumi Matsuno did with Tactic Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics. But, again, that's all in retrospect. The trio story that makes up Fate doesn't represent the worst or the lowest point in series history. Well, maybe Conquest does, but even the best of these barely rises above being okay.
It's a study in contrast when looking at the gameplay, where all the promise the design provides is usually delivered on, put to good use with some of the highest highs in series history. Even the very worst maps are admirable for showing a level of creativity absent from much worse entries. However, where Fates found the most success was raising the series up from the state of relevancy that Awakening left it on to a point where it's considered a major IP, selling well over 1 million copies prior to its European release. Heck, the current president of Nintendo, Tatsumi Kimishima, said as much when they announced the recent free-to-play Fire Emblem mobile title. It goes without saying that short of another bomb of a major entry, Fire Emblem will continue to see new iterations in the years to come. If there's anything that the next one should take away from all of this, it's the very same thing Intelligent Systems should have from Awakening when designing Fates. Keep a solid balance between crafting a satisfying story through a series of challenging maps and support conversations with a wonderful cast of characters. Embrace ambition, but without compromising focus on what the series does best, marrying story, characters, and gameplay together in a seamless fashion.